Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for so many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect, but what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, whether it's difficult bosses and coworkers, your successes, your failures, your major adventures, your minor adventures, the next step is to develop how you share those stories. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you, you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into lessons. During this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast features my dear friend, Wendy Weiner Runge. Well, I'm fortunate enough today to be sitting here visiting with my friend Wendy Weiner, who does movie production and a whole lot of other interesting things, always creative, always artistic, and always authentic. And I'm excited today to talk to her about how our ancestral stories impact our identities and the stories we tell ourselves and share with others. But first, before we get started, Wendy, I would love it if you could either share a story or share something about you that most people might not know.
Well, thanks, Sarah. It's great to talk to you. Love your podcast. Really, I just laughed last week with Melissa. It's maybe a neuroscientist isn't supposed to be funny, but I kept going, oh gosh, that's really close to home. Oh wow, that was really close. So it was great. So enjoy your podcast. So I'm just gonna fangirl all over you for a little bit, but just love it. So proud of you.
That's okay. I'll take it.
Cool. The rock star. Okay, so something most people don't know about me. I'm a middle child. And when I was born, my mother, they expected to have 4 boys for some reason and didn't. They have 3. I have 2 sisters, no boys at all. And when I was born, my father woke my mother up because, 53 years ago, they would knock the moms out. I don't really get that deal, but they would put them to sleep and they'd deliver the baby and then they'd come back around and they'd, wake them up and tell them what happened. And my father woke my mother, and I was supposed to be William. I was most definitely a boy because I was always engaged in utero. I was busy doing something, running around. And he said, honey, wake up. Congratulations, Mazel Tov. We have another healthy baby girl. And my mother woke up and she said, groggily, oh, poor Wendy. She's going to be the middle child. And then she went back to sleep. And my dad was so taken aback. They'd never discussed a girl's name at all. So, whoops, I guess we have one. And second of all, it's like, oh my gosh, why would she lament the idea? But I love being a middle child. I think it's been the most fantastic run. I have great sisters, and there's that series of T-shirts that says, I'm the oldest one. I made the rules. I'm the second one. I'm the middle child. I'm the reason there are rules, and I'm the youngest child. I don't bother to follow the rules.
The rules
or whatever.
Don't apply, right?
Thank you. Exactly. So in my family, it was kind of that way, but it was really we just had a fantastic opportunity to grow up in the middle of America in Omaha, Nebraska, and it was a really great experience. And I'm never uncomfortable anywhere. Maybe that's from being a middle child, and I like to work in teams. And I think it's so, sorry, Mom, but I think that earliest prediction, hopefully what didn't come true. I've really enjoyed it. So I always say the quiet, shy middle child. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about you, and I think that's funny because we've known each other for a while, and we've shared a lot of interesting stories. I am also a middle child.
See, I knew that about you, but I knew that about you instinctively. I think there's just something about a middle child that maybe I'm thinking there's a different kind of risks we take. I don't know. A little safe, maybe. The oldest child kind of use the machete and cut through the weeds, and we can kind of maybe do fun things, and the youngest child maybe, I don't know. It's working for you, girl. So there you go.
Well, yeah, you too. What's funny is that I did not enjoy being a middle child growing up.
Oh,
I had a hard time.
The whole Marcia thing?
Yeah, I was Marcia for sure. It was hard for me, partly because I have an older brother and younger sister, and my brother and I are only 2.5 years apart, but my sister's 5 years younger. So my brother and I were too close in age, I think. We were really good friends until my sister was born. And then we had something to fight about.
Yeah,
And
I get that.
yeah, so I think it was a little
I get
different.
that.
Maybe it's the gender thing, but
And I also think there's a whole thing with, I mean, I always ask people, where were you in the birth order? You know, what's your sibling situation? Because I think that really determines, as we talk about stories from our family, it determines the way we perceive ourselves. So as you're really the first daughter. So that is kind of a different thing than being just like the number two. So you're going to do different things than he did, and there's kind of a close age. And then the little one is just going to be like the one everybody, the cherry on the cake, you know, oh, look at her. And it's like, really? Hello?
yeah,
So I could see that. There you go.
Still is.
There you go. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
You know, that definitely makes sense. And it's funny because I never believed in astrology.
Mm-hmm.
But
when's your birthday, Sarah?
See, I'm an Aries, and
Ooh.
all the Aries I know that are born around the same time as me have very similar risk-taking and impulsive behaviors.
Really?
And we all, as a matter of fact, there are about 6 of us here in my little town in Montana, in Helena, that we get together every year to celebrate our April birthdays. And our partners, our spouses, are always sort of on edge about coming to this party because getting all of us together is
just
really,
called the bordering on dangerous party. That's
seriously, it's wild. We go through so much wine and food, and we laugh so hard that we walk away with stomach aches, all of us, including our partners. But
fantastic.
Yeah, but I never believed in it until I was in my 30s, and I started meeting other people that I could associate with those characteristics. And I realized it's not so much about the astrology itself. I think it has more to do with what you're observing at different stages of childhood development.
That's a very good point.
Us Aries, all of us born in that midway through spring, like the beginning to mid-spring, we are observing adults being really unpredictable. And we're observing the weather being really unpredictable.
And the weather determines a lot of things, let's be real, because it really determines, I promise we'll go trick-or-treating, and then it's a blizzard. We're not going trick-or-treating. It's like, what do you mean? Kids carry that grudge forever. But it was a blizzard. There was 26 inches of snow. I remember a Halloween blizzard we had here in Minnesota, and there was 26 inches of snow. It started 2 days before Halloween, and it just didn't stop.
But in Minnesota, it doesn't stop you.
Yeah, well, one would think, but it's a little early. Like, you haven't really made that mental shift to, oh, geez. I remember one woman came to the door with her child so bundled up. Like, that was it, the whole day, whole evening. One gal. And I opened the door, and I literally dumped the entire bucket on the kid's bag. And I said, you are the bravest woman alive. And she said to me, with this expression on her face, she said, it's so much better to do this until he gets cold than to live for an entire year with him saying, but you didn't take me trick-or-treating. So I guess we pick a half an hour of torture as opposed to 364 days of why didn't we? Yeah. There was a blizzard. So
that's so funny. In Montana, people pick their costumes based around what they think the weather's going to be like, and we see a lot of polar bears and clowns and things that you can stuff a lot of stuff into.
See, Minnesotans are just for lack of a better analogy, Minnesotans are like Vikings. And they will specifically wear dudes will walk around in bathing trunks. I'm not kidding, until way into the first snow, and think that it's flip-flops, because then you emerge from a long winter like we had. We had a blizzard. We're just talking about it. We probably in the middle of April we had 20 inches of snow, like one shot deal, 20 inches, and it was crazy. That was a God snow. In other words, everyone around here said, if they are faith-based or not. They said, if God put it here, he better take it away. We're not shoveling anymore. We're done. So, and at the end of that winter, everybody emerged from absolutely like Vikings, like, oh, we survived it. Let's go, wrestle a buffalo or something. That was the demeanor. It's that, oh, we lived through it. We are superior. We're not superior. Yeah. There's something just not totally right, but it is what it is. Which is actually a really good transition into the whole theme of our podcast, which is so funny. I have one other quick crazy thing to say, by the way. We talk about birthdays. Amy Blashka and I have the same birthday.
Oh,
Isn't
that's
that
funny.
crazy? So
It's not
yeah,
that surprising.
a little bit, a little bit. We both cry, we both laugh a lot. But when we found that out, we were like, "Oh my gosh, that's the coolest thing!" Haven't you ever connected with somebody based on nothing else other than that you have the same birthday?
Yes,
So it's just that. Okay,
absolutely.
that was my last bit. All right,
Yes, I love that. I love
let's
that.
talk about families.
Yes, let's. So the reason I wanted to talk to you about this, there are two reasons. One is your project with the film Rachel,
Yes.
and where that story comes from. But another reason is that I had such an interesting conversation with you about a year ago about how our family history can impact our identities. And
Mm-hmm.
then just last night, I had this conversation with my aunt on my dad's side. And all these years, I was under the misunderstanding that both of my sets of grandparents came from Russia 2 or 3 generations ago. And then I just found out that my grandfather actually was born in Russia, in
Wow.
what's now Belarus.
Oh,
And he was a very little boy when he moved to the United States, but he
you
was
might be
actually,
related to Gary Vaynerchuk.
it
Look into it.
could
Look
be, I
into
should
it.
look into that. But
Yeah.
it's fascinating because when my older son was graduating from high school, my mother offered this gift of doing one of those ancestry
Mm-hmm.
DNA tests. And all of those videos, the promotional videos of those ancestry tests, they show how surprised people are by, their family narrative is all about being Scottish, and it turns out they're like 1% Scottish and 90% British or UK.
Wow.
I don't know. Yeah, English, I guess I should say. And that there's like very little Scottish in them, but they've had this family narrative all these generations. So they're big surprise, big reveal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when Jacob sent away his DNA test, I was ready for our family narrative to be adjusted.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, okay, we've always been told that both sets of my grandparents came from Russia, from the same part of Russia at different times, and settled in different places, but ended up together. Not surprising considering the Jewish communities of
Right.
that time.
Right.
So I'm waiting to find out that that's not the case. And it comes back. Now my husband is not Jewish, and well, he converted to Judaism,
Mm-hmm.
but he was raised German Catholic, and his family is from everywhere: France and Scotland and England and Germany, mostly Germany
Nice.
and Poland. So it came back that our son is 47% Ashkenazi Jew.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So I was a little surprised because I wasn't surprised.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to talk to you about this. So I'd love to hear a story that kind of applies what you think your ancestry, a story from your ancestry that you think kind of um, applies to this theme and your current identity as a human being and as a mother.
That's such an interesting question. By the way, if you hear sirens, do not be
Mm-hmm.
concerned. I live across the street from the police station.
Oh, okay, good
So
to know.
most often they're not coming for me. So that's a good
Most
thing.
often.
Most often. Caveat. So that's such an interesting question because my husband also converted and is also German, but he's 100% German. And my husband's family came from Germany. Mind you, his grandmother was in prison in Berlin in the early 30s because she was so opposed to the Nazis that she took it upon herself to hide Jewish children from the Nazis as the parents had been deported. They would come home from school at the end of the day and they would find the apartments empty and the parents were gone. And so she would hide them. And she did that successfully for a while, and then she was caught. And then she was in prison for 3 years, but it was a life sentence. Actually, it was a death sentence. But they were able to falsify some papers and bribe some officials, and they snuck her out, and they never bothered to look for her. Thank God. So she was
Wow.
successful in coming back to her children. Interestingly, when she was arrested, and Peter's grandfather, Peter John, couldn't be more German than that. Actually, he kind of could, but his grandfather was away working. He was an engineer, and he was working for the government, a forced labor working for the government. So he wasn't there with the children, and she was the caretaker. And when she was taken away, her 16-year-old sister, her youngest sister, she was the oldest of 9, and her baby sister swept in and adopted the children, because if a blood relative didn't adopt them within 72 hours, they were swept into the Nazi orphanages and they were just taken away.
Oh.
So she, the 16-year-old, raised the two young teenagers for 3 years. While that told you. So raised them by herself for 3 years, and then she seated. Then when they got her out, the father was able to come home. They got her out, and then it was before World War II, and then she went back and started her own family and lived to be very old, 90 into her 90s. But my father-in-law had vivid memories of how strict she was, and how strict she had to be because she was just a few short years older than he was. And so she had he had this memory of him being marched off, and then her coming home and the aunt taking care of them, and she was barely older than he was. It was just such a fascinating thing, but it really shaped him in a way that later in life, because they never discussed it. I'm sure they were not prone to discuss it. But when he was captured by the Nazis and accused of being an American spy, and then he was somehow transferred into a Russian prison camp, and he was there for years and years, he learned to be very, very, very tough. He was a very smart young man, brilliant, ended up with an MD and a PhD, but he became very tough, and only certain things, small things, would affect him, life and death issues. And so he was able to sustain himself for 7 years in POW camps, and then one day they just opened the gates and said, just go home. And that was just it. 1950.
Wow.
So
Wow.
So there was a lot of that stoicism that's normal to the German culture. At the same time, when he was training to be a physician, he was actually doing his rotation in anesthesiology, and a mother was on the table, and she had some kind of an abscess or a tumor or something in her abdomen, and he was about to put the gas mask on her, and she took him by the hand and took the gas mask off, and she said to my father-in-law, who was just a young med student, he said, Herr Doctor, you must make sure that I wake up because I have 3 children at home waiting for me. Oh. And the image of it was up to him to make sure that she woke up. And that image was that was so visceral to him, the idea that he could be the cause, that he changed his focus and he became a pathologist, and he primarily dealt with cardiac pathology and helping to invent artificial heart valves and things of the nature that saved, as opposed to he never wanted to be directly involved with patients because he simply could not stand that kind of responsibility.
Wow.
So our stories shape entire generations, what they can do. A little story like that so profoundly affected my husband that he did not pursue medicine. He's not a healer by nature anyway. He's a chef. He's a feeder, not a healer.
He's a nourisher.
Yeah, exactly. And I think those stories of responsibility and things that we just toss off to our children. We're like, oh, one time Grandpa said. But those things, Opa in this case said, those stories so profoundly affect not only this generation, but the next and the next. I had a brief discussion about the fact that I read a paper once on depression. The risk of depression in the children of Holocaust survivors is much higher. They are genetically predisposed to have depressive tendencies if their parents survived the Holocaust.
Wow.
It permanently damaged their genetic strain perspective. I'm not even sure exactly what, but enough so that there were a lot of Holocaust survivors and their children who really battled with PTSD and depression. So maybe there's the ripple in the pond isn't just what happens to one generation, it happens, several. And without knowing the stories that cause that, maybe finding a solution isn't so simple. I don't know.
I love that you brought this up because I have a friend, Cassie Murphy Brazil, who is a Native American living in Western Montana in the Arley area. And she did research for her PhD on generational PTSD among Native tribes and Native families. And
Mhm.
she is finding all kinds of correlation between depression and PTSD symptoms and
Mhm.
parents who suffered from major trauma and
Oh my gosh.
grandparents. Sometimes it's a
Right.
grandparent that suffered major trauma. The parent did not necessarily, but it's the grandchild that is suffering with these symptoms and they don't know why necessarily. They do know that they're associating it with generational trauma. And I think about that a lot. And I
Mhm.
also, part of the reason I'm so interested in this is that I find myself picking out jewelry based on the kind of support and encouragement I think I'm going to need that day.
Oh, wow.
And what I
Wow.
find is like I have this beautiful blue necklace. It's in my profile picture on LinkedIn right now.
Mhm.
I
I
wore
know the
it
necklace. Love it.
thank
Yeah.
you. I wore that on, I think it was the second day of my No Longer Virtual conference this year, and that's where that
Mm.
picture was taken. And when I woke up in the morning, I thought, I need my mom.
Oh.
And she gave me that necklace years ago, many years
Mhm.
ago. And I wore that. And when I hold it, I feel I'm very much about that kind of energy that you feel as a result of touching something. And
Right.
I had this
Absolutely.
sensation that I had her right there with me, even though she was
Absolutely.
in Sacramento, 1,000
Absolutely.
miles away. And I do the same
Absolutely.
thing. I have earrings that I made out of a pearl necklace that my grandmother on my mom's side and my grandmother on my dad's side bought for me when I was a little girl.
Mhm.
And every year from the time I was one, they would each contribute a pearl. So it started, my mom
Oh.
contributed one for the very first year. So I had three pearls on a little gold chain when I was one. And then every year they'd each add a pearl to this chain. And at some point, I think because my sister was born and then other grandchildren were born,
Right.
they stopped. And I ended up with, get this, this is something that you'll appreciate, 13 pearls,
Oh, yeah. Wow.
which is, of course, a number that is resonant with Jewish people. And
Absolutely.
it would have been even better at 18, but it stopped at 13. But
13. That's big. That's a
it's
big
still a
number.
good number, yes.
How
And
how interesting that is. Wow.
yes, and it wasn't planned, but I took that necklace because, wearing it as an adult didn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
So it just didn't look like a string of pearls with 13 pearls on an adult neck. But I ended up taking those pearls and having an artist friend of mine make earrings out of them for
Mm.
me and my sister, and at the time, my sister-in-law. And when
Mm.
I feel the need for that generational strength and resilience,
Right.
I wear those earrings.
That's beautiful. Um, I have a very I have something similar that I'm almost embarrassed to talk about because I think it's kind of goofy. I thought it was, so I just got some really interesting positive reinforcement from an old friend of mine, and I like to have a manicure once in a while, and I like it to just look really um, polished and professional. And ordinarily,
Mhm.
I work crazy hours. I work from 9 to 5. I work. I executive produce feature films, so I do the business part of show business. So I work from 9 to 5 on the business part, and then my partner Noah Bewley is really the creative. So I work. So I take a break from 5 to 9, make dinner, hang with the kids, do whatever, talk to my husband, and then we work from 9 at night till 5 in the morning on the creative stuff. It's pretty common. We'll see the sun come up, or we'll be laying out the characters on the big pull the dining table all the way out to its biggest place, and take the index cards of characters, and that's kind of how I work. And I'm so not a foofy kind of a gal.
Right.
I
Very
do
low maintenance when it comes
low
to that
maintenance, but
stuff.
my fingernails. So a couple years ago, it dawned on me that my mother has some cognitive disconnect. I have fantastic parents, incredibly supportive, but there's some cognitive disconnect. There's memory loss issues that are rapidly increasing. And I looked at my hands, unpolished, and they're my mom's hands. And
Mm.
it made me so sad that my mom's hands aren't as busy. She was a theatrical costumer and an artist, and fantastic mom, and she did all kinds of great things, but that's kind of diminished. And I look at my hands, not polished, and I think, okay, I have to continue to sharpen my sword. I have to continue to polish my nails so that I don't forget to use my hands to do all the things that I think that I'm supposed to do. And so it's a really big cycle, more than sitting in a chair for an hour and having somebody, you know, pamper you.
Your hands.
It's more, if I look at my hands, I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm motivated to keep moving forward. Not that my mother did anything wrong to be in this particular situation. She's almost 80. She's still delightful. But I want to make sure that I continue to move forward. And that little silly little thing.
It's a cue.
It's a cue to just pick up and keep moving. When it's 4 o'clock in the morning, but if my fingernails look good, I can deal with it. I'm very blessed. I'm good with like 3 hours sleep. I'm fine. So that helps a lot with that ridiculous schedule. And I unplugged Friday afternoon, and I'm Saturday night, and that's a lot of napping and a lot of hanging out with the family. But it's those little things, which are just stories we tell ourselves to prevent or produce the outcome that we want, that we think we need to have.
Right. And the signs we choose to see.
Exactly. And the culture that we come from and the diversity of it. Nobody else in my husband's whole family is Jewish. His parents became Jewish, and my husband, and he has no cousins. He has no really living relatives. So he's it. And so the stories that my father-in-law would tell me, wouldn't even tell Peter because he really felt they were too painful for Peter, but would tell me I can pass on to my children. On the one condition, my father-in-law made me promise that I would never write a book or a movie about what he had been through. I was never allowed to do that. And I gave him that promise, and I respect that. But I was able to weave some beautiful little nuances of his mother's story and his story into Rachel, which has kind of a similar story. There's a little bit of a shared experience there. And I feel it's a cathartic experience. And my children really feel like, okay, finally the story is being told. We know that certainly during that period in Europe, millions and millions and millions of stories were lost. Exactly. 6 million Jews, 10 million Russians. The fact that we're here is pretty much of a miracle. So, and all those stories are lost. And so if we are, and how much, and we get to this, the key point is, how much healing power do stories have?
Exactly. And that's
not knowing, so much worse than knowing and saying, oh, that's where this comes from.
Exactly. I mean, it's no different from understanding childhood trauma. It's no different from that. Because you cannot address PTSD without knowing what the trauma was in the first place.
And it's so, how long, we talk about this all the time, but how long can you hold the beach ball underwater? Cannot be done indefinitely.
Right.
At some point in time, poof.
Right. And now that we know that generational PTSD exists, that is a real thing and people struggle with it, it's even more, that beach ball is filled even more with air.
Right.
That it's at some point it's going to erupt out of the water, and we have to address it. And I love that you said that about how these stories can heal us, and that so many hid those stories away. And I think that's the difference between a lot of the Native American trauma and the Jewish trauma of the Holocaust, is that the Native Americans are storytelling people, as are the Jews. But what's interesting is the Jews seem to focus on the stories of the Bible. We tell that Passover story every year to make sure people don't forget.
Same story. Yep.
But your father-in-law, even though he's not Jewish or wasn't Jewish, is one of so many thousands of people who experienced those horrific experiences of the Holocaust that won't share them with their children because they think they're too painful.
Right.
Where the Native American people that I know share those stories, they pass them along from generation to generation so that they know what happened to their families.
Right.
So then interesting.
So then it begs the question, is there a right way? And you can't look at society success on a societal level. You can't, this is not monopoly. The money is not all the same. It's all different culturally. Success, success. Oh my! I have a son who's a doctor, a lawyer, and whatever. Like, okay, that's success to some Jewish moms. Conversely, I have 4 children who are healthy and strong and lead their own lives and have made healthy decisions and what have you. So but success
and the continuation of a culture, the continuation of the culture and tradition.
Right. It's success is so subjective by culture, I think, and we have to accept that as well. That it's just, I know African American culture has been so. Um, with rap music, like Noah and I spent some time in Harlem last summer, and it was hot, middle of July, and walking the streets and listening to the music, and you could feel it's hot, and it's angry, and it's negative, and I mean, the energy there, and it's like, wow, where does this come? We know where the music
Well, we know
comes
where
from.
It comes from. Yeah.
Because you could feel it more than you could hear it around. You could feel it. It's like, oh, I get it now.
And the question is, how do you adjust that message so that you're still telling the story, but that you're telling it with some hope for the future?
That's the $64 trillion question. Oh my gosh! If we answer that today, Sarah, boom.
Yeah, but then we'd have to find a way to distribute the answer.
That's it. Just give it away. We're just, you know what? We're just giving this away.
Yeah.
I think the first step. So there's a quote that the lead actor in Rachel came to the set with, and he looked and looked for a way to represent the and we'll talk about the film in a second, but like the lead actor, Ukrainian Catholic, very proud man. And what quote kind of he put on the top of his script kind of represented the story to him. And it was from Elie Wiesel, Nobel Prize winning laureate.
Yes.
And
the author of Night.
Exactly. And Elie Wiesel had a quote that to this moment haunts me. And he said, "To listen to a witness is to become a witness." Mm-hmm. And I found that to be so powerful, because we live in a society, what do they say, in a room where everyone's yelling, no one's listening. Social, gotta have this car, gotta buy this watch, gotta. You're not, unless you have this, you gotta have, five girlfriends, whatever it is, society. Who's listening? But I choose, as much as I talk, which is 70% of the time, but I choose to, I shifted my focus. I want to be a witness. Right. And that means I have to listen more, which means sometimes I have to ask questions that people are a little reticent to answer. And then when they open up, it's can be cathartic, it can be difficult, I understand. At the same time, it's about allowing them, saving them space to tell their story. No judgment, no questions, no one saying your story is wrong. Just giving it over.
That's not how it happened.
It's not that
I mean, as a sibling, you hear that a lot. That's not how it happened. I can't believe you remember it that way.
Yep. Yeah. It's how they perceive it, and then we become witness in a way.
No, that makes sense. And when I think about the reason I feel that sense of resilience and strength from my grandmother's pearls is that I heard stories about them that when they told a story, it wasn't necessarily with the same energy, but it was when my aunt told me a story about my grandmother on my father's side, that her grandmother moved to the United States by herself with 3 daughters. And they moved in with her brother, and the father was too sick to travel to cross the Atlantic. So they ended up in, I think they were in Cleveland. I don't remember where they started. It might have been Detroit, but they ended up in Cleveland. But she ended up being basically a rum runner. She was carrying cases of liquor during the Prohibition, delivering cases of liquor down into speakeasies. This little woman, she couldn't have been a big woman. My family is not big. And this little woman is carrying these cases of whiskey or whatever down into these speakeasies, down narrow stairs and up narrow stairs. And the reason she could get away with it was because, first of all, she was confident. So she'd just walk like she knew what she was doing. And second, she didn't look the part.
Right.
So, so my grandmother had that as a role model to say, man, if she could do that, I can do that.
Right.
And so that's where I get this sense of generational resilience and strength.
I think that's not fantastic.
Her story.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Because the image doesn't fit the story. Those are the most interesting stories. When you
Mm-hmm.
see someone who's absolutely beautiful, I mean, really physically beautiful, and they open their mouth and they're literate and they're articulate and sensitive, and you're like, wait, I didn't perceive you to be like that. You know, we all jump to that concept. And I
Right.
spend most of my days with my business partner, who I could have told this story in the beginning, that not a lot of people know this also. But my producing partner, who directed Rachel, wrote Rachel with me and directed it. His name is Noah, and he was a high fashion model for almost 10 years. Went on a lark. His sister wanted to take, she was 12, she wanted to take some headshots and maybe do some modeling gigs, because every 12-year-old girl wants to be a model, I guess. And thank God mine didn't. But and so she went, and he went, tagged along, and the photographer said, hey, let me get some headshots of you. He's like, yeah, whatever. So he did, and she got a nice little modeling gigs, you know, some whatever, I'm not sure, some local place, and he booked Adidas International was his first client. And then he kind of
Wow.
took off in that
Tripping
genre.
into an opportunity. Yeah.
Totally. And then he grew, and he's super tall and what have you. And his Simon, God bless Simon Sinek, his why is to change people's perspective. Because you look at him and you're like, okay, 6'3", 170 pounds, perfect looking, and here's a creative who is just screeching to get out. And everyone said, just stay in front of the camera. You know, you're Calvin Klein loves you. You did great for GQ. Abercrombie loved you. Versace loved you. Da, da, da. You know, whatever, Snapchat. He didn't want to be in that position. But
Right.
taking what he looked like, just like your great-grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
and just flipping that story. I want to be behind the camera. I want to create. I want to be responsible for what comes out on the other side of it. I want to tell stories, and I want to change people's perspective. That was an uphill battle.
Oh,
Uphill
I'm
battle.
sure.
And
Because
he was,
his
yeah,
image didn't work for it.
it didn't work. It just didn't
Yeah.
work. So what does that say about the rest of us who take people at face value? I love these stories about these beautiful little coffee shops who are every one of the crew, every one of the employees has special needs.
Mm-hmm.
And people go in and they're a little trepidation, and they're so loved and coddled in there by the staff and everybody. It's such a great experience. And they walk out and they say, oh, I didn't expect it to be like that. I've never spent a lot of
Right.
time with people with special needs. Isn't it great when a story comes out on the other side? You're like, wow, that changed me. That's what our family stories can do if we're willing to tell them and we're
Right.
willing to listen.
And
It
we're willing to
changes
tell
us.
them in a way that
And
is hopeful,
which is
that
your
gives us that
job, Sarah.
strength. Well, it is, and I love that. I mean, that's something that I love about what I do when I'm coaching people is I love to draw out those stories and then kind of help them see it for the value that experience provided my clients. So I've
Isn't that
mentioned
funny?
I've
It's
mentioned
funny.
some during other podcasts, but it's just there's something so rewarding about when the light bulb goes on and they change the narrative. It's the same story, but the way they tell it is different.
Right. Exactly. Or
Yeah.
maybe it's the first time there's a line in the film. Just to give a smidge of backstory, Dr. Robert Kumarchik is a Minneapolis resident, been here, he's 79 now, and almost 79. And when he was a 5-year-old boy outside of Kiev on a farm, and they were Ukrainian Catholic, they were safe from the Nazis, but they lived across the road from the Jewish cemetery. So every day they'd watch Jewish people be marched by the young Ukrainian Nazis into the cemetery to dig their own graves and be killed. Every day,
Ugh.
as a 5-year-old boy, he was witness to this. So he found out when a woman named Rachel and her 2 boys sought refuge in the house with his family, found out that his family had built a shelter in the barn, and they were actually rescuing these Jews. They were coming through, and neighbors and friends and people were sending them to them. So Rachel and her family took refuge. Unfortunately, it wasn't the outcome that they had hoped. And Bob watched the family be murdered right in front of him, his best friend and in a horrifying way. And this woman, Rachel, that was just an angel. I mean, just a beautiful woman. And in our film, she's played by Brittany Benjamin, a beautiful actress, just mesmerizing. So 50 some years later, after he's watched this massacre. 50 years later, he's become successful in the United States. He's called back to Kiev on business. He goes. He's going to give the keynote address at this very formal event where they're building a business school, and he's being honored, and he steps up to the podium, and sure enough, seated directly in front of him is the Nazi that killed Rachel and the boys.
Oh my God! Wow.
What do you do? So we stop the film there, and we show the trauma. We show all of that in flashbacks as Bob is being interviewed by a historian, and he's pulling this information out of Bob. He needs to get the information. Bob needs to deliver it, and this historian is really trying to gather these facts before it escapes, and before it's too late. And the historian asks the question, why didn't you tell the story before? And Bob says, as most victims of childhood trauma, he's honest. He said, I didn't know it before. And that's really a key component of what you do, Sarah, is you give people the safety and the ability to, I'm kissing my daughter, hello. Hi, sweet girl, how are finals? The safety and ability to tell their story in a way that builds them up, as opposed to, oh my gosh, this happened. This happened, and here's how we reacted to it. Here's what the family did. Here's why our business is so important to us because of this. Like it's not just here's my story. It's here's my story, and here's what we've done. Right. I have a fantastic business mentor, really like the best business mentor in the world for me, in the world. And he has a 4-word modus operandi. So what? Now what? So what that happened to you? Now what are we going to do? Which is why Noah and I named the company Now What Studios, because we just love that concept.
That's great.
And the thing is, and now what? So the story in itself has such importance. And then someone who's so empathetic like you are, and the rest of us are trying to be, who can say, and now what do you do with that? Pull that strength out of it. Now what do you do? Is so important in society today, because that way nobody just stops with that story. It doesn't just stop, it continues. And the growth continues, the healing continues, and then business continues.
And some people, for some reason, they still haven't figured out how storytelling applies, particularly to those internal messages, but also to business. I recorded a podcast with Kimberly Davis, and we talked about a few things related to this and how your personal stories can change the way that you understand yourself and step up to be brave. And I just love her idea, her whole theme. She's just a fantastic person, but she gives such great strategies. And she talked about how each time you're about to step up, you have to be brave over again, that it's not a one-time thing. You have to find that brave every time. And what we came to the conclusion was, when you know those stories that you've created, and when I work with clients, we come up with kind of a portfolio of stories to use and to reveal when necessary with the right audience. But what I realize is that once we know those stories about ourselves, when we're about to step out again and we have to take a risk, we have to be brave, it helps to look back at that and say, all evidence points to. So if you're looking at those stories and you know your successes and you know where you learned certain lessons, you can say, okay, all my evidence says I can handle this.
Right.
Then it helps give you that boost to take that next step.
Right. If I did it then, so what that happened, now what am I going to do? I'm going to continue on because I've seen myself do it before.
Right.
I've seen myself do it. So I know I can do it. And if I haven't seen myself do it, I've seen my mother's hands do it. And if my mother could do it, then I could do it. Or my grandmother, or my great-grandmother, or my uncle, or somebody in my family who has been in a similar situation. I'm made up of the same stuff. I just have to open that little pod and, pop that Tide Pod or whatever and
put on those earrings.
Put on those earrings and be like, okay, look, I'm empowered with that. I own that. 47% of me is that. That's big. That's huge. So that's a great, but it all starts with the story.
It does.
It starts with the story. Why do people love to go to films? Why do people love movies? Oh my gosh, people say, oh my gosh, the new Solo movie only made $113 million. $113 million. Let's do the math. So what does that mean? 1 million people saw that movie over that one weekend. 1 million people. That's a lot. So you look at the big picture, is that we want to think that we can do something that was previously outside of our realm.
Mm-hmm.
And storytelling, on hearing it, being witness, is a great way to go, wow, if they did it, I wonder how I'm going to do it too. I can do that. And once we start asking that question, we're virtually unstoppable. Almost, again, bordering on dangerous. We're going back there.
Right. And actually, Melissa Hughes and I talked about this in our podcast a couple weeks ago, that even watching certain emotions can trigger our own emotions. And I suggested that, if somebody really needs an oxytocin boost, to watch a love story.
Mm-hmm.
Where people are hugging and loving each other up. And because even watching it can bring those emotions to you. And then in the podcast that's released this week with David Amerland, we talked about the fact that we live vicariously through those stories that we read and we hear.
Absolutely.
Our brains are actually acting as if we are experiencing it directly.
How many people, adults, full-size adults, will tell you when you talk about, let's say, mention the monkeys in The Wizard of Oz, will involuntarily, I told you, shudder. It's such a visceral reaction. Have we ever seen a flying monkey? I've not. Do we know they're really? No, but it's such an impactful image to us. So those things, witnessing it now, conversely, witnessing someone do something good. Oh my gosh, Simon Sinek talks about it all the time. How incredibly important it is just to be witness. My mom and her beautiful hands, we used to work so hard to catch us doing something good. It wasn't, I saw you trip your sister. Maybe that happened. But she'd say, I saw you do that. I saw you cut that last piece of cake in half and give your sister the bigger half. I saw you cut it out. We used to laugh. But she looked for the good. So much of what in the stories that we tell, we can tell them to be, the monkeys are terrible. We can say, Dorothy just really it was just a woman who wanted to go home. Mm-hmm. And there were all kinds of things in her life. She was so brave. Time after time, she was brave. And she was brave for the people that she loved. She took she took it on herself to be, and they in turn, even the Kelly Lions, took it on themselves to be brave for her. Yeah.
That's one of my all-time favorites, by the way. It's funny that you brought that up.
Me too.
Well, let's wrap this up. It's been a while, and I've been really enjoying chatting with you about this. And I know, as usual, I'm going to be, after a conversation with you, I'll be processing this for a while. And I'm guessing that we will have more to add to it in a while, and maybe we'll have you back on the podcast. But Wendy, thank you so much for taking the time to record this with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, honey, the honor is all mine. It's such a privilege. If everybody just takes a moment and thinks of a story about themselves that really matters, just the way you open the show with, and have the courage to share that with just one person you think we're really not connecting. I need you to know something about me. Imagine how many bridges we could build, how many bridges you could build. It's just think of one thing that you're willing to share. Yeah, and just go do it, and just look how cool the bridge is going to be.
That's right. So for our listeners' benefit, in the blog post associated with this podcast, you can connect with Wendy through LinkedIn, and I will share a couple of other links that we referred to so that you can participate in some way in the next thing that Wendy's taking on. So thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation, Wendy.
I'm always looking forward to it, Sarah. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you.
And have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Be well. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?